The casino breathed like a living thing. Aria Verano felt it the moment the elevator doors parted on the 42nd floor. That low, vibrating pulse that had nothing to do with the music and everything to do with money, secrets, and the particular brand of danger that dressed itself in Italian wool and French champagne. The air was thick with cedar and smoke, with perfume applied by women who understood that scent was a weapon, and underneath all of it, something colder, something that reminded her of the way a concert hall felt right before the lights went down. All that held breath, all that anticipation. She stepped out with her case in hand, black, worn at one corner, the leather soft from a decade of airports and green rooms and borrowed dressing rooms, and the doors closed behind her like a sentence ending. Miss Verano. A man materialized from the shadows beside the elevator bank. He was built like a door, wide and flat-faced, wearing a suit that cost more than her rent. "Mr. Caruso asked me to show you to the green room." Of course he did. "Lead the way." She followed him through the main floor of Club Aurum, and despite herself, despite everything she'd told herself on the cab ride over, she looked. You couldn't help but look. The space was stunning, in the way that things designed to seduce always were. All dark marble and amber light, the ceiling vaulted and painted with something that looked suspiciously like a genuine fresco, cherubs and gods, and the suggestion of suffering rendered in ochre and gold. Round tables draped in black linen held the city's most carefully anonymous elite. Card tables along the far wall, roulette wheels spinning their quiet orbits, a bar that seemed to go on forever, backlit bottles arranged like a cathedral's stained glass. And at the centre of it all, on a raised dais framed by two enormous black curtains, sat a Steinway Model D concert grand, its lacquered surface catching the light like still water. Aria's chest tightened at the sight of it. She hated that. Hated the way the instrument still reached inside her and turned something, some old key she'd never found the strength to throw away. Through here, the man, she still didn't know his name, and she suspected that was intentional, held open a door disguised as part of the wall panel, and she slipped through into a narrow corridor that smelled of lilies and cold air. The green room was not green. It was all ivory and dark wood, a leather sofa, a vanity with bulb lights, a bottle of still water and a glass placed at precise right angles on the table. Someone had put a single white rose in a vase near the mirror. Aria set her case down and looked at it for a moment, at the particular perfection of that rose, and felt something uneasy settle at the base of her spine. She was not here because she wanted to be. She was here because 3 weeks ago her brother Marco had called her from a number she didn't recognize. His voice stretched thin over the line like something pulled too tight. "I'm in trouble, Aria. Real trouble." And then a different voice had come on, smooth, accented, unhurried, telling her that Marco's debt had been purchased, that her brother's life was an interesting variable, and that someone had mentioned she was a pianist of some talent. "We'd love to have you perform at Club Aurum," the voice had said. "Friday and Saturday evenings. We pay generously." The implication had been naked and unashamed. Play, or Marco pays in a currency that couldn't be deposited anywhere. So here she was, Aria Verano, finalist at the Leeds International Piano Competition, alumna of the Juilliard School, described by the New York Times as possessing a touch of uncommon emotional intelligence, sitting in a luxury green room in what she was fairly certain was one of the most exclusive illegal gambling establishments on the eastern seaboard, about to perform for criminals. She opened her case, drew out the small packet of rosin she kept for her fingers, the extra hair tie, the program notes she didn't actually need anymore but kept out of habit. She looked at herself in the mirror. Dark eyes, dark hair pulled back severely, cheekbones her mother had called aristocratic and her first boyfriend had called intimidating. She was wearing the dress she performed in, black, floor-length, simple enough to disappear behind, and elegant enough to stand in front of an audience without apology. She looked like someone about to walk into a lion's den. She looked exactly like what she was. A knock at the door. "5 minutes, Miss Verano." Aria pressed her palms flat against the vanity surface and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her teacher, Maestro Poletti, had drilled into her at 14 when stage fright had nearly swallowed her whole. "The music is not yours," he used to say. "It was here before you, and it will be here after. You are only its mouth tonight. Open and let it speak." She stood up straight, picked up nothing, left everything in the green room except herself and the music she carried inside her like a second skeleton. The man was waiting in the corridor. He walked her back through the panel door and out onto the casino floor, which had settled into a different quality of silence at her approach. Not quieter, exactly, but more aware. Conversations dimming slightly, the way they do when something shifts the atmosphere of a room. She walked to the dais without looking at anyone, climbed the 2 steps, adjusted the bench with a particular fussiness that was not fussiness at all, but precision, and sat. She placed her hands in her lap, looked at the keys, and somewhere behind her, from an elevation she couldn't see and didn't try to find, she felt something land on her like a physical weight. Not the collective gaze of the room, she was used to that, had learned to wear it like a coat. This was singular, specific. A single pair of eyes finding her across the space with the kind of attention that didn't bother to disguise itself. She played the opening measures of Ravel's Pavane pour une enfant défunte and let the notes fall into the room like something ancient being remembered. And in the private mezzanine above the main floor, separated from the room by a sheet of one-way glass and the accumulated gravity of his own silence, Luca Caruso set down his glass. He did not pick it up again for a very long time. Luca Caruso had not become what he was by being careless with his attention. He gave it the way other men gave money, deliberately, sparingly, always with the awareness that what you spent it on revealed more about you than anything you chose to say. He had learned this young, at his father's knee in a brownstone in Carroll Gardens that smelled of garlic and gun oil, watching Enzo Caruso receive guests with a particular quality of focus that made each man feel, for the duration of his audience, that he was the most important person in the world. It was a performance, Luca understood now. A performance of power so refined it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. Or perhaps it had simply become real. Perhaps that was how it worked. He stood at the glass of the mezzanine with his hands loose at his sides, a posture his Lieutenant Dante would have recognized as the stillest, most dangerous thing about him, and watched the woman at the piano. She was not what he had expected. He had expected competence. He had arranged for competence, had requested it through the particular channels by which such arrangements were made, had been told that Aria Verano was talented, that she had studied at the best conservatory in the country, that she had placed in competitions, that she had performed at Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall, and at the kind of European venues that made certain people feel, incorrectly, that they had transcended the circumstances of their birth. He had expected a professional, someone polished and a little nervous and grateful for the generous fee. What he had not expected was this. She played with the kind of stillness that was itself a form of violence. Her body barely moved, a slight lean into the keys at the heavier passages, a barely perceptible sway during the quieter ones, and yet the music filled the entire 42nd floor with something that went well beyond competence. It was grief. Controlled, precise, exquisitely contained grief poured out through her fingers into the mechanism of the piano and transformed, alchemized, into something so beautiful it bordered on unbearable. The revel ended. There was a pause, brief, charged, and then she moved directly into Chopin. The Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. Luca knew it. His mother had played it on an upright in the brownstone's front room, badly and with great love, and hearing it now in this woman's hands was like hearing a familiar story told by someone who had actually lived it. Around him, his casino continued its business. Cards were dealt. Chips exchanged hands, whiskey was poured and drunk and poured again. But the room had changed in some fundamental way since she'd begun playing, and Luca noticed that even his most transaction-focused guests had paused in their conversations, drawn, without seeming to realize it, towards something warmer, something older than the game they were here to play. He became aware of Dante at his shoulder. "She's good," Dante said. He meant it as an observation, neutral, but Luca heard the slight undercurrent of surprise. "Yes. You want me to set up the usual arrangement? Friday and Saturday, finish by midnight?" Extended. Luca didn't look away from the glass. Thursdays as well, same compensation per night. A beat of silence from Dante, who was perceptive enough to read the room even when the room was only his boss standing very still in front of a window. "I'll reach out to her manager. She doesn't have one." He had read the file. Aria Verano, 31 years old, born in Staten Island to a Sicilian father and an American mother who had died when Aria was 9. One brother, Marco, 26, a series of bad decisions that read like a textbook case of a man who had grown up in the shadow of a talented sister and found increasingly destructive ways to assert the size of his own shadow. A teaching position at a small conservatory in Brooklyn that she held alongside her performance career, which had been, in the past 3 years, contracting. Not for lack of talent, for lack of the particular willingness to play the promotional game that the classical music industry required. She was, Luca thought, the kind of woman who refused to compromise on the things that mattered to her. He recognized that. It was a trait he respected and would, he knew, find useful. "I'll speak to her directly," he said. Another beat. Dante's silence now had a different quality, the silence of a man who was carefully not saying several things. "After the performance?" "Yes." Below, the Chopin concluded.
A scattering of applause from the tables nearest the dais. Appreciative, slightly reluctant, the sound of people pulled briefly out of their own important evenings and now returning to them. Aria sat still for a moment after the last note faded, her hands resting on her thighs, her posture very straight. And then she turned her head slightly toward the mezzanine. She couldn't see him through the glass, he knew that. But the movement was so precise, so directed, that something at the base of his neck contracted. She knew she was being watched. She knew where she was being watched from. And she had turned not to search or to find, but simply to acknowledge. The smallest, most deliberate motion, a kind of check. I see you seeing me. Luca picked up his glass finally and drank. He was not a man given to impulse. He had built everything he had on the opposite of impulse, on patience, on the long game, on the willingness to wait as long as it took for circumstances to arrange themselves into the configuration he needed. His father had been volatile, operatic in his rages and his warmth, and Luca had watched that volatility cost Enzo Caruso things that careful men would have kept. He had decided somewhere around age 16 that he would not make the same mistake. He had kept that decision for 15 years. He looked at the woman at the piano, who was now arranging her hands for the next piece, something he didn't recognize, something modern and angular and startling that cut through the amber atmosphere of the room like a cold wind through a door left open, and felt the first, small, precise crack in something he had spent a very long time building very carefully. He did not call it what it was, not yet. He called it interest, professional, aesthetic. He watched her play, and the crack spread, hairline thin and silent, through the centre of his careful architecture. And he did not hear it, because he was not listening for it. He was only listening to her. She was wiping down the keys when he came in, not a habit she'd maintained everywhere. Her students at the conservatory called it eccentric, that insistence on cleaning the ivory after each session. But it was one of the few rituals she'd kept from her earliest training, from the woman who had first taught her in the community centre on Bay Street when Aria was 5 years old. Respect the instrument, Mrs. Ferrante had said. It gives you everything. The least you can do is leave it clean. She heard the door open behind her but didn't turn. She was, she realized, operating on a particular kind of controlled stubbornness, the same instinct that made her lift her chin at auditions, that made her play louder when a committee looked bored, that made her refuse to look like someone who could be easily unnerved. She had been summoned here. She would not perform gratitude as well. You added a third nocturne. The voice was the one from the phone. She recognized it without having to look. That measured, low cadence, the accent very faint, more an occasional colour in certain vowels than anything that could be placed geographically. The programme I was sent listed 2. She turned then, because continuing not to would have seemed childish. The room needed it. He was standing just inside the door, and he was— she had not been prepared for this, which annoyed her— beautiful. Not handsome in the obvious way, not the kind of face that asked to be looked at, more the kind that made looking feel like something you'd decided to do yourself, something personal. Dark hair, longer than she'd expected, brushed back from a face that was all clean angles and a particular quality of stillness that she associated in her experience with either great patience or great danger. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt open. He stood the way men stood when they had never, in their adult lives, needed to make themselves smaller to fit a room. "The room needed it," he repeated. There was something in his tone that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite approval. A closer relative of both. "What made you decide that?" "The acoustics are warmer than I expected for the space. The Ravel wanted a longer tail." She folded the cloth, set it in her bag. "You didn't come to discuss programming?" "No." He walked forward, not quickly, not with any visible purpose, just a slow movement that reduced the distance between them to something more conversational. He stopped at a comfortable remove, not encroaching, not retreating, precisely calibrated. "I wanted to offer you an extended engagement, 3 evenings a week instead of 2. Aria looked at him steadily. She had prepared herself for many things on the cab ride over, and she prepared herself now for the shape of what this might mean, what it might cost. "My agreement was for Fridays and Saturdays. I'm revising the agreement." I wasn't aware it was revisable. Something shifted in his expression. Nothing dramatic, barely anything at all. But she had spent her life reading micro-expressions across piano keys and across the faces of students and judges and conductors, and she caught it. The slight recalibration. The faint acknowledgement that she had not done the expected thing. "Everything is revisable," he said. "The question is, what revision serves both parties?" "What it serves me," Aria said carefully, "is going home at a reasonable hour and teaching a 9 a.m. class on Monday without having spent my entire weekend in a casino. The compensation would increase accordingly." "I don't—" She stopped. She did need the money. She needed it specifically because Marco needed it. And Marco's debt was the chain that had walked her through those elevator doors tonight, and she was not in a position to pretend otherwise. She hated that he could probably see this. She hated the way that information sat between them, a fact he owned and she could not take back. "What's the figure?" He named it. She kept her face entirely still, which took more effort than she would have liked to admit, because the number was significant. The number was the kind of number that, stacked across several months, began to look like a solution. "I'll need to rearrange some of my teaching schedule," she said. "Of course." He nodded, and there was something in it that was almost courteous. Almost. "I'll have Dante draw up the revised terms." "Dante is the man who met me at the elevator." "Yes. Does he have a last name?" "The ghost of something. Not quite a smile. Everyone here has a last name. Some of us prefer not to use them professionally." Aria picked up her case. The familiar weight of it settled into her shoulder. Ground wire. Anchor. "I'll expect the paperwork by Tuesday. You'll have it Monday morning." She moved toward the door, and he stepped aside, not quickly, not nervously, but with a deliberateness that reminded her of a chess piece making a move that was also a question. She was almost past him when he spoke again. "The Scriabin you played in the second half." His voice was very level. "The etude in D-sharp minor. That's not a piece most performers choose for background music." Aria paused, did not look at him. Her hand was on the doorframe. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." "Why did you choose it?" She considered briefly, not answering. Then, "Because it's about something trying to break free of itself, and failing, and trying again, and the trying is the whole point." She turned her head enough to see him in her peripheral vision. It felt appropriate for the room.
She left before he could respond. She didn't look at the casino floor as she crossed it, didn't look at the roulette wheels or the card tables or the faces of the men who watched her pass with that particular quality of attention that she had spent her adult life navigating. She walked to the elevator with her back straight and her case at her side, and her pulse, she was honest enough to admit to herself, running about 20 beats faster than was strictly professional. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. As the doors closed, she let herself look back just once and found him standing at the edge of the mezzanine above, visible now, watching her with those dark, patient eyes. The doors closed. She faced forward. She did not allow herself to think about the way he'd looked standing in the green room. That particular quality of attention, like being the object of something's entire focus, like being heard. She thought about Marco instead, about the debt, about the numbers. She was very good at thinking about things that weren't the things she was actually thinking about. Marco's apartment smelled like takeout containers and borrowed time. Aria stood in the doorway of his kitchen the following morning with a coffee she'd brought and couldn't drink, and watched her brother sit at his table with the particular hunched posture of a man wearing his mistakes like a physical weight. He looked older than 26. He looked like someone who had been running toward something for a long time and had only recently stopped to look at what it was. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "I know. Before it got to this level, before someone was able to, before it became something that could be used." Aria. He looked up. His eyes were dark like hers, the same Sicilian inheritance, the same narrow face. But where her face had been carved into angles by discipline and time, his had gone softer, more porous. The face of someone who felt everything immediately and processed it later, if at all. "I know. I'm sorry. I know." She sat down across from him. The chair was unsteady, one leg shorter than the others, and she made herself sit still on it rather than fidget. "Tell me the full amount," he told her. She had known it was bad. The voice on the phone had given her a number that night, the night everything had become this. But she had held that number in her mind as a kind of abstraction, a problem at a remove, something to be solved from a safe, theoretical distance. Hearing Marco say it now, in his kitchen, in the morning light, made it real in a way that the phone call hadn't. "Who did you borrow from originally?" "A guy. A business connection," I thought. He said it was a private loan, no banks, no credit check. "Marco, I know how it sounds. It sounds like you borrowed from someone who was going to sell the debt the moment it became profitable." She kept her voice flat, not because she wasn't angry, but because anger wouldn't move them forward, and forward was the only direction they had. "Do you understand who has it now? Do you understand what the Caruso family is?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yeah, I Googled." "You Googled." She closed her eyes briefly. "The man I met last night, Luca Caruso, his father built the family's position in this city over 30 years. The son has grown it significantly. They're not," she searched for the right word, "they're not what you see in movies. They're not loud. They're structured. They're embedded in things you don't see on the surface." "Are you trying to scare me or inform me?" "Both." She opened her eyes. "I'm going to play at Club Aurum 3 nights a week. The compensation will go toward the debt. I need you to promise me something." Aria, I need you to promise me you won't do anything while I'm doing this. No new loans, no new schemes, no contact with these people except through me. You sit still, Marco. Can you do that? He looked at her with the expression she had known her entire life, that complex mixture of shame and love and the particular resentment that comes from being saved by someone you love, which always feels, no matter how unfair that feeling is, faintly like humiliation. I can do that. Promise me. I promise. She didn't fully believe him. She never fully believed Marco, which was not a failure of love, but of evidence. He had broken promises before, not maliciously, not from cruelty, but from that organic inability to hold the future steady in his mind long enough to honour commitments made in the present. It was, she had thought more than once, almost the precise inverse of the quality that made her good at music. She lived in the future of a piece. She could hear it whole before she played the first note, could hold all of it in her mind as a structure, as an architecture she then walked through in time. Marco lived exclusively in the present. It was part of what made him charming. It was entirely what had led them here. She drank her coffee, which was cold now. She looked out his window at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings, pale and indeterminate, the colour of something not yet decided. "What's he like?" Marco asked. "Who?" "Caruso." She considered the question more carefully than it deserved, which told her something about herself that she filed away without looking at directly. "Careful," she said. "Very controlled. Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She stood, picked up her coffee cup, rinsed it in his sink, set it on the drying rack with the particular efficiency of someone doing small tasks to avoid thinking about large ones. "I don't know. Someone louder?" She dried her hands, turned. "I'll transfer funds to your account at the end of each month. Do not, and I mean this, Marco, do not contact him directly. Don't go anywhere near that casino." "I won't." She picked up her bag. At the door she stopped and looked back at her brother and felt the full weight of everything between them, the years, the absence of their parents, the particular way siblings carry each other, whether they want to or not, like a shared nerve that runs between two separate bodies, so that what hurts one always reaches the other. "I love you," she said, "which is the only reason I'm doing this, and not letting you sort it out yourself." He almost smiled. "I know. Don't make me regret it." She left him there in the kitchen with his hunched posture and his borrowed time, and she took the subway back to Brooklyn through the tunnels under the city, those dark, rushing channels. And she thought about debt, about what it meant to owe something, about the fact that she had, in the course of a single night, handed over a portion of her own freedom to balance the books of someone else's recklessness. She thought about Luca Caruso's eyes. She opened her score on her phone, Beethoven, the Waldstein Sonata, which she was preparing for a performance in March, and read the notes until the station arrived and she climbed back into the light. The weeks that followed had a particular texture. Aria had been a musician long enough to understand that repetition was not the enemy of meaning, that in fact meaning most often arrived through repetition, buried in the repeated gesture until familiarity stripped away the performance of it and left only the thing itself. She had played the same phrases thousands of times, in practice rooms and concert halls and half-empty conservatory recitals. And every so often, in the middle of something she had played 100 times before, the music would arrive freshly, as if for the first time, and she would feel it from inside like something opening. She had not expected this to happen at Club Aurum. She had expected it to feel like work. Necessary work, unglamorous work, the kind you did with your teeth set and your eyes on the finish line. She had expected to feel compromised. She had, if she was entirely honest with herself, expected to hate it. Instead, the space surprised her. The acoustics, which she had mentioned to Caruso that first night, were genuinely remarkable. Someone had spent serious money on the room's design, and it showed in the way the piano's sound moved through the space, the way her pianissimos carried and her fortissimos didn't harden. The Steinway itself was one of the best she had played in years, meticulously maintained, voiced to a warmth that suited the kind of repertoire she was choosing. And the audience, if you could call a casino floor an audience, was more attentive than she had anticipated. Not attentive in the way of concert hall audiences, seated and silent and obligated. Attentive in the way of people who had not come for music and had been caught by it anyway, which was, in its own way, the more interesting response. She began to choose her programs more deliberately, not just what she felt like playing, but what the room wanted. What would serve the particular density of a Friday versus the looser atmosphere of a Tuesday? What would hold the attention of a table deep in a hand of poker, and what would release it? It was, she realized, a kind of conducting, reading the room, finding the through line. She did not see Luca Caruso directly for the first 2 weeks. She knew he was there. The mezzanine, she had confirmed its existence by studying the room between her 2 sets, was always occupied in some capacity. A presence rather than a person, felt more than seen. Occasionally she caught movement behind the glass, a shift of shadow that could have been a body turning. She played toward it without meaning to, and noticed this, and corrected it, and found, several minutes later, that her hands had drifted back. On the 3rd Thursday of her engagement, she arrived to find a different bottle on the dressing-room table, not the standard still water, a small, elegant decanter of something dark. She uncorked it and inhaled, and identified, with the precision of a woman whose Italian-born father had been serious about wine, a Barolo of notable age. There was no note. She set it aside and drank the water. During her second set that evening, she played the Goldberg Variations, not the complete work, which would have taken well over an hour, but a selection of the more meditative arias, the ones that moved like breathing, like something a room could fall asleep to or wake from. It was not her usual choice for the venue. It was quieter than what she normally brought. She played it anyway, and the room changed in a way she had begun to trust. That subtle reconfiguration, the gradual orientation of people's bodies toward the sound without their awareness of it, like flowers and light. Afterward, Dante was waiting in the corridor. "Mr. Caruso would like to know if you'd join him for a drink. Upstairs." Aria looked at him. Dante was, she had come to understand in these weeks, something more than a lieutenant. He was precise, and he was observant, and he had the quality of someone who had made peace with his own function in a way that she found, despite herself, faintly admirable. He delivered messages without affect, which was either professional discipline or a genuine absence of opinion. She hadn't determined which.
"I have an early class tomorrow," she said. "Mr. Caruso is aware of that." Which meant he'd checked. Which meant he knew her schedule. She considered this for a moment, held it up to the light of everything she knew and didn't know, and decided that the correct response was not alarm, but practical navigation. She was not afraid of Luca Caruso. She was cautious of him, which was different. Caution was a tool. Fear was a loss of one. 20 minutes, she said. Dante led her not back through the casino floor, but up a private staircase behind a locked door, up one flight into a space she hadn't seen before. A private lounge, smaller than the main floor, more personal. Bookshelves, actual bookshelves, floor to ceiling, and dense with volumes that didn't look decorative. Low, intimate lighting. A pair of sofas around a low table, and near the window that looked out over the city 43 floors below, 2 chairs angled toward each other, with a small table between them, bearing 2 glasses and the evident continuation of the Barolo. Luca was already standing at the window. He turned when she entered, and she was struck again, as she had been the first night and had been trying since to rationalize into irrelevance, by that quality of attention. As if the room reorganized itself slightly around wherever his focus landed. "The Goldbergs," he said, by way of greeting, or perhaps by way of a question. "Yes." She sat down in one of the chairs, not as a concession, but as a claim, taking up space on her own terms. "Is this the first time you've heard them live?" He came to the other chair, sat with the same unhurried quality that characterized all his movement. "No, I heard them at Carnegie Hall. A Japanese pianist, 8 years ago, maybe 9. But they were different tonight. Slower. More present." He picked up his glass. "Glenn Gould used to say that the Goldbergs were a perfect architecture, that Bach built a room you could live in. Tonight felt like—" He paused, and she noticed the pause because it was the first hesitation she had witnessed in him, the first place where the words didn't arrive prearranged. "Like you were actually in the room." She looked at him across the small table. "You know, Gould. I know a lot of things that would surprise you." "I doubt that," she said, and then was surprised to find she meant it not as a deflection, but as a genuine truth. She was beginning, despite all her best efforts, not to doubt that at all. He had read everything. Not just about her, though her file had been thorough, assembled by people who were very good at assembling thorough files, but about the music itself. This was what Aria discovered over the following evenings, in the incremental way that a person is discovered, piece by piece, revelation in small installments, each one landing quietly enough that the cumulative effect arrived only much later, when you turned to look back and realized how far you'd travelled. Luca Caruso had a private library that he appeared to have actually read. She had noticed the books on her first visit to the upstairs lounge, the density of them, the lack of uniformity that distinguished a genuine collection from a decorative one. Books of varying ages and conditions, some clearly old, their spines faded to soft illegibility, some recent and well handled. The following Thursday, arriving to find him already in the lounge with a glass and an open volume he set aside when she entered, she'd asked. Directly, because she had found that direct questions were the most efficient tool with him. They cut through the elaborate architecture of suggestion that seemed to be the ambient language of his world. "What are you reading?" He'd shown her the spine. Kierkegaard, either/or.
She had looked at him for a moment. That's an unexpected choice for a Friday night. Kierkegaard argued that the aesthetic life, pleasure, sensation, beauty, is the first stage of existence, but that it ultimately leaves the person empty.
He poured her glass without asking.
I've been thinking about whether he was right. Arya sat. And? I think he was right about the emptiness. I'm less certain about the cause. He looked at his glass. He thought it was the lack of commitment, that the aesthete refuses to choose, to be defined by a choice. But I think there are people who choose one thing entirely and still find themselves empty. She considered this. You're describing a different kind of problem. Yes, the kind that isn't solved by choosing more deliberately. Yes. He looked up. Those dark eyes, settled and patient, with some interior thing behind them she had not yet found the name for. The kind that might be a problem of what you've chosen.
The conversation moved, as their conversations had begun to do, through territory that was ostensibly abstract and felt entirely personal. She wasn't naive about this. She understood that this was the shape of it, that they were talking about themselves in the grammar of ideas, that the distance of philosophy was the thing that made these conversations possible at all, for both of them. She was not ready to close that distance. She suspected he knew this, and was, with that characteristic patience, waiting. What she hadn't expected was how much she enjoyed it. She had few people in her life who thought the way she did, who moved through ideas with the same combination of rigor and genuine curiosity, who weren't threatened by disagreement and didn't need the conversation to arrive at a comfortable conclusion. Her colleagues at the conservatory were knowledgeable but specialized, their conversations orbiting the same familiar suns. Her friends, the ones she still had, the ones her increasingly demanding schedule hadn't eroded, were warm and real and not particularly interested in Kierkegaard. And here was Luca Caruso, who ran a criminal empire from a building that contained a fresco on its ceiling and a Steinway in its centre, quoting Danish existentialists and waiting for her response with the kind of genuine interest that she had, she realized, been a little hungry for. She resented this. The resentment was clean and useful, and she kept it close. "Tell me something about the Goldbergs that I don't know," he said one evening, the fifth or sixth of these after-set conversations. She had stopped counting precisely because the counting felt like an admission. She thought about it. They weren't written for keyboard originally. The story that Bach wrote them for an insomniac count, Goldberg was his student, supposedly played them for him at night, is probably apocryphal. But there's something true in it anyway. There are pieces of music that do something specific to the nervous system. The aria that opens and closes the Goldbergs has a bass line that repeats regardless of what the variations above it do. The ground remains constant. Everything else changes. Everything changes, and the ground holds. He was very still. "That's what you were playing for last week?" "Yes." "Why?" She had not intended to answer this. She watched herself answer it anyway, with the slight sense of someone noticing from a distance that their own actions are moving faster than their intentions. Because sometimes when everything else is uncertain, you need to play something that holds, something that doesn't move regardless of what happens over it. She set down her glass. "I should go." "You should," he agreed. He walked her to the private elevator, not Dante, him, for the first time, and they rode down 2 floors to the level where a car was always waiting.
At the door, he held it open with the particular quality of a man doing a courteous thing without it touching the exterior of him, without warmth and without coldness, simply the act itself. "Next Thursday," he said. It wasn't a question. "Next Thursday," she confirmed, and got in the car, and did not allow herself to look back as it pulled away. In the elevator riding back up, Luca stood with his hands in his pockets and felt the particular quality of silence that a room acquires when a specific person has left it. He had felt this before in professional contexts, the absence of someone useful, someone whose presence had calibrated the room. He had felt it when his father died, a version of it. He had not felt it like this, like something you noticed in your hands before you noticed it anywhere else. He pressed the button for the 44th floor, his private floor, the penthouse, the space above the casino that was entirely his and that he kept separate from his business life with the same deliberateness he applied to everything. He went to the window. The city extended below him in all directions, its 10 million lights suggesting the 10 million intersecting stories of 10 million separate lives, and he found himself doing something he almost never did. He tried to imagine what she was thinking, in the car, moving away through the city below. He couldn't, and the fact that he couldn't told him something. Most people were legible to him. He had made his life, in many ways, out of legibility, out of the ability to read what people wanted and feared and would and wouldn't do. Aria Verano was not legible, not because she was hiding. He had met many people who hid, and hiding had its own signature, its own telltale quality of something slightly turned away. She wasn't turned away. She was entirely present and entirely opaque, and this combination was something he found he had no existing vocabulary for. He was going to have to invent one. The man's name was Victor Solis, and he arrived on a Wednesday. Aria didn't know this immediately. She knew it later, the way she came to know most things about the deeper mechanics of the world she'd stumbled into, backward, after the fact, reconstructing events from fragments that only made sense in retrospect. What she knew on the Wednesday in question was that when she arrived at Club Aurum for what had become a routine Thursday performance, she'd come a day early to practice on the Steinway, a privilege Dante had arranged after she'd mentioned once casually that she preferred to acclimate to an instrument before performing on it. The atmosphere of the casino floor was different. Not visibly, not to anyone who hadn't spent 3 months learning to read the particular weather system of this space, but she had, and she could feel it. A tension in the posture of the floor staff, a quality of eyes that moved more than they settled. Dante met her not at the elevator but 20 feet from it, slightly ahead of schedule, and walked her to the green room at a pace that was fractionally faster than usual. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Everything is fine, Miss Verano." The particular quality of his fine, which landed about 2 inches to the left of reassuring, told her that something was not. She practiced for 2 hours in the main room, the floor empty at this hour, the house lights up and clinical, the Steinway patient beneath her hands. She was working through Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, the most technically demanding piece in her regular repertoire, a work that required the kind of concentrated physical and mental engagement that effectively emptied her of anything else. She needed that emptying today. She had been, in the weeks since she'd begun playing at the club, carrying a growing internal argument with herself, and the argument was becoming inconvenient. The argument was about Luca Caruso. specifically about the fact that she had begun to look forward to Thursday evenings in a way that had nothing to do with the performance and everything to do with the hour afterward. The books, the wine, the conversations that went somewhere she hadn't gone with anyone in longer than she wanted to measure. She had made herself a list, as she did when her emotional weather required organizing. The list contained items including, "He is a criminal. His money is not clean. You are here under coercion, effectively. Whatever this feels like, it is not a level playing field. You do not know what he is capable of." Marco. That last item stood alone, its implication complete. The list was very clear and very correct, and made very little difference to the part of her that lit up when she walked into the upstairs lounge and found him already there. She was midway through Scarbo, that terrifying final movement of Gaspard, all hammered octaves and harmonic vertigo, when she became aware of someone else in the room. She finished the phrase, stopped, turned. He was standing at the edge of the dais, a man she hadn't seen before, perhaps 40, well-dressed, but differently than the Club Aurum regulars, a degree of flash that read as belonging to a different aesthetic, dark eyes and broad shoulders, and a smile that arrived before it was earned. "Don't stop on my account," he said. His accent was Latin American, Venezuelan or Colombian, she guessed. That was extraordinary. Aria stood. "The room isn't open." "I know. I was looking for Caruso and someone mentioned the pianist was practicing." He stepped closer to the dais. "Victor Solis." He extended a hand. She took it briefly. "Aria Verano." "I know." He smiled again. "Luca's been generous in describing you." Something about this, the familiarity, the possessive ease of "Luca's been generous," registered in her as a small flag. Not danger exactly, more the particular quality of a person testing a response. "We have a professional arrangement," she said. "Of course." His eyes moved over her in a way that was practiced enough to be almost invisible, and wasn't. "How long have you been playing here?" "A few months." "Do you enjoy it?" It was a simple question, and yet it landed with a peculiar weight, as if it meant something other than it said. Aria looked at him steadily. "It's interesting work." He laughed. A genuine laugh, she thought, which didn't make him less dangerous. Diplomatic. Luca picks his people well. He glanced around the room, the fresco, the tables, the gleaming bar. He's always had an eye for quality. His gaze returned to her. "In all things." She was saved from responding by the sound of the door at the far end of the floor, and she didn't have to look to know who had come through it. She had learned Luca's particular quality of arrival, the way the room registered his presence a fraction of a second before he became visible, the way heads turned like iron filings toward a magnet. He crossed the floor without hurrying. His eyes moved between her and Solis with no visible expression, but she had learned enough in these months to read the language of his restraint, and what she read now was something that moved very quietly beneath his surface, very controlled, and was not happy. "Victor," he stopped at the dais, "Dante was looking for you." "Dante was sent to look for me." Solis's smile hadn't moved. "I got distracted." He glanced at Aria with a quality of meaning that was entirely for Luca's benefit. "Understandably." "We should talk. Upstairs." Luca's voice was exactly the same as always, level, quiet, unhurried, and Aria had learned enough to understand that this was the most dangerous version of it. Solis shrugged pleasantly. Of course. He turned back to Aria. A pleasure, Miss Verano. I hope to hear you perform properly tomorrow. She plays Thursday, Luca said. Tonight she's practicing. The distinction, the ownership implicit in the correction, hung in the air for a moment. Solis's smile changed slightly, acquiring a knowing edge. Thursday, then. He walked toward the door Luca had come through, unhurried, the easy walk of a man who had never in his life been required to be elsewhere urgently. When he was gone, Aria looked at Luca. He was looking at the door Solis had left through. Then, with an almost audible reorientation, he looked at her. Practice time is yours, he said. I'll have the floor cleared. I was almost finished. Take your time. He turned, then stopped without turning back. Don't engage with Solis beyond pleasantries. Aria held herself very still. Is that a professional recommendation? Yes. Then I'll treat it as such. A beat. Is there a reason I should be concerned? He turned now, and what she saw in his face was something she hadn't seen before. Not warmth, not its absence either, but something more specific, something that wanted, she thought, to be something it wasn't yet willing to declare. No, he said. I'll make sure of that. He left. Aria sat back down at the piano. Her hands found the opening of Ondine, the first, dreamlike movement of Gaspard, and she played through it slowly, methodically, giving each phrase more space than it needed, letting the music do what it had always done for her, replace the noise inside with something ordered, something controllable. She played until the room grew dark, and someone came to ask if she needed the lights. He couldn't sleep. This was not new. Luca Caruso had not been a good sleeper since approximately age 19, when his father had given him his first operational responsibility, and the weight of it had settled into his central nervous system as a permanent, low-frequency alert. He had made accommodations for this over the years, a bedroom designed for function rather than comfort, blackout curtains, a strict absence of screens after a certain hour, a glass of whiskey he didn't always drink, but kept at the bedside like a talisman. Tonight, none of it helped. He stood at the penthouse window at 3 in the morning, the city below him reduced to its bones at this hour, the traffic thinned, the lights more discreet, and therefore more beautiful, and thought about Victor Solis. Solis was a business relationship, a specific kind of business relationship, one that Luca maintained with the same careful distance he maintained all partnerships, close enough to be useful, far enough to be clean. Solis moved certain things across certain borders, and in exchange, certain things on Luca's side of the operation became more manageable. It was transactional, which meant it was uncomplicated, which meant it had nothing to do with trust and everything to do with arithmetic. The problem with Solis was not the business. The problem was the way he'd looked at Aria. Luca was aware, with the clarity of a man who had spent considerable effort maintaining awareness of his own mechanisms, that what he was feeling right now was jealousy. He identified it with the same precision with which he identified other inconvenient realities, clearly, without drama, with the full intention of managing it appropriately. Jealousy was a signal. It pointed at something. It did not, in his experience, constitute permission to act. And yet, he had not been prepared for this, for any of this. He had arranged her presence at Club Aurum as a solution to a practical problem. a specific musical need for the venue, and a mechanism for extracting value from a debt that would otherwise have involved considerably less pleasant resolutions. He had expected to be pleased with the music and unaffected by the musician. He thought about what she'd said weeks ago about the Goldbergs. The ground remains constant. Everything changes, and the ground holds. He thought about the way she played, that particular quality of reserve in her body that broke just barely in the moments of greatest musical intensity. The slight forward lean, the almost invisible softening around her eyes that she probably didn't know she exhibited. The way she walked into a room that was designed to be overwhelming and simply didn't respond to it. Not because she was performing composure. He had seen performed composure his entire life, could identify it at 50 paces, but because she had her own internal weather system, and it was considerably more interesting to her than anything external. He could not touch her. He knew this with the same precision with which he'd identified the jealousy. She was in his world under conditions that were not entirely voluntary. The debt, the brother, the chain of circumstance that had walked her through his doors. He had a code. It was not the kind of code that would survive close legal scrutiny, but it had an internal consistency he had maintained since he was old enough to have a code, and one of its clearest provisions was this: you did not take what wasn't freely given. The debt was a professional matter. The performances were a professional matter. What happened in the upstairs lounge on Thursday evenings, the wine, the conversation, the particular quality of being known by someone, that had become something else, and the something else was his own and entirely separate from the debt, and he would not contaminate one with the other. He was aware of how much restraint this required. He was aware that restraint, left long enough under the right pressure, could do things that structural materials could not. His phone lit. A text from Dante, brief and without preamble. Solis is asking questions about the pianist. Thought you should know. Luca looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed a response that was equally brief, equally without preamble, and set the phone face down. He went back to the window. The city at 3 a.m., the Hudson a dark streak at its western edge, the bridges strung with light, the whole impossible accumulation of 10 million lives stacked on a narrow island that had no business being as significant as it was. He thought about a woman who played Bach to a room full of gamblers and managed, without appearing to try, to turn the room's attention towards something it hadn't known it needed. He thought about the fact that he was standing at his window at 3 in the morning, thinking about her. He recognized this as a kind of answer, not the one he would have chosen, were choosing an option, but Luca Caruso was a realist in the most comprehensive sense of the word, which meant he was very good at recognizing what was true and very bad at pretending otherwise. He was not in the business of pretending otherwise. He had made his decisions in life, all of them, even the darkest ones, with his eyes entirely open. He picked up his phone and opened the file he kept on her. Not the operational file, that lived elsewhere. This was something else he'd assembled himself, privately. A collection of recordings he'd downloaded, performance videos found on YouTube channels run by conservatories and competition archives. An interview she'd done for a classical music podcast 2 years ago, in which she'd spoken about the difference between playing for audiences and playing for music, and why the distinction mattered. He put his earbuds in. He lay down on the bed he couldn't sleep in and listened to her play the Waldstein Sonata at a recital in Vienna, and the city went on outside his window, and the river moved, and somewhere on the other side of the city she was probably asleep, and he lay in the dark and listened, and felt the particular quality of a man who has identified something he cannot walk away from, and has not yet decided what, if anything, to do about it. The Waldstein ended. He didn't take the earbuds out. He started it over from the beginning. His name is Victor Solis. Aria sat across from her friend Helena Marsh in a coffee shop in the West Village on a Sunday that had the soft grey quality of a city resting. Helena was a cellist, third chair in the New York Philharmonic, a position she occupied with the kind of cheerful competence that concealed serious virtuosity. And she was the person Aria had told about Club Aurum. Not everything. She had told Helena that she was doing an evening performance residency at a private venue, that it paid well, that it was helping with a family situation. Helena, who had known Aria for 12 years and knew when she was editing, had asked 3 follow-up questions, gotten 3 carefully partial answers, and had the grace to accept the shape of what was being offered without pressing for the fuller version. Today, Aria had looked up Victor Solis on her phone on the subway ride over, and what she'd found had changed the quality of what she needed to say. "I found a few things," she said. She turned her phone across the table. A 2019 Reuters piece, a 2022 Interpol watch list reference. Helena looked. Her expression shifted through several registers, arriving at a particular quality of careful attention that Aria recognized as her friend at her most serious. "Aria, I know. This isn't a performance residency situation. I know." Aria pulled her phone back, drank her coffee. Outside the window, 2 small children were being pulled along the sidewalk in a red wagon by a man who was clearly their father, his face wearing the specific expression of a person who is simultaneously exhausted and constitutionally unable to stop smiling. She watched them pass. "I told you it was complicated." Complicated. Helena set down her cup. "Is he, the man who runs this place, is he keeping you safe from people like Solis?" Aria looked at her friend. "Yes," she said, and was briefly surprised by the lack of hesitation in her own answer. Helena absorbed this. "How sure are you about that?" "As sure as I can be, under the circumstances." Which was less than she would have liked, and more than she had any logical right to. And somewhere in the mathematics of that discrepancy was the problem she'd been running from for several weeks. She trusted Luca Caruso, not naively. She had no naivety about what he was, about the nature of his world, about the fact that his protection came from a kind of power that didn't answer to courts or appeals, and that made its own terms. But she trusted the particular quality of the man, which was different. She trusted that when he said something, it was true, and that when he implied something, he meant it, and that the code she sensed in him, glimpsed in certain choices, in the way he conducted himself in the upstairs lounge, in the very specific nature of his restraint with her, was real. Trusting a man who ran an illegal casino with ties to organized crime was, she was aware, not a ringing endorsement of her judgment. "How's Marco?" Helena asked, with the diplomatic pivot of a good friend. "Sitting still, for now." Aria turned her cup. "He's talking to someone, a therapist, finally, the one I found him." She felt the familiar, complicated softness she always felt when she thought about Marco at his best, at the versions of him that showed up when he wasn't running from himself. He's trying.
That's something. It is. She looked at her phone, at the dark screen now reflecting her own face back.
Tell me something uncomplicated, she said.
Helena told her about a difficult stand partner and a premiere next month, and the fact that her cat had, for reasons unknown, developed a vendetta against the second movement of Dvorak's cello concerto and staged a protest every time she practiced it. Aria laughed, genuinely, with her whole face, the kind of laugh that cleaned something out, and Helena watched her with that quiet attentiveness and said nothing about what she saw. On Thursday evening, Aria arrived at Club Aurum and found a different kind of energy on the floor. Not the tense, alert energy of Solis's visit, but something lighter, a particular quality of occasion that she'd come to associate with the nights Luca was present on the main floor rather than the mezzanine.
He was at a corner table with 3 other men when she came through, and he didn't look up, but something in the set of his shoulders told her he was aware of her arrival the way she was aware of his. She played that night with a transparency she hadn't intended. Something in the sati she chose for the first set, the gymnopédie, that stripped away technical display and left only tone, only feeling, the musical equivalent of a room with all its furniture removed. She felt exposed by it and played it anyway. After her second set, Dante came with the usual message. The lounge was lit differently tonight. The lamp on the bookshelf rather than the overhead, warmer, more interior. Luca was at his chair but standing, near the window, a glass in hand, and when she came in there was a moment before he turned, a moment in which she saw him in profile against the city light, very still, and something about the privacy of it, the unknowing quality of a person not yet performing their public self, landed in her chest with unusual weight. He turned. "Satis," he said, by way of hello. "Sati," she corrected. "I know. I was acknowledging the choice." She sat down. He came to his chair. "You're playing differently this week," he said. "Am I? Simpler, more exposed." She looked at him. The lamp threw its warmth across the left side of his face and left the right in shadow, and she thought that this was, in some way, exactly what he was, half lit, half dark, the boundary between the two a clean line that she had been tracing in the dark for weeks. "I've been thinking about what it means to play honestly," she said, "as opposed to playing well." "What's the difference?" "Playing well is for the music. Playing honestly is for something else. Some need you're putting into the instrument because you don't have another place for it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need, Aria?" It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Verano, not the formal remove she had understood and accepted. Aria. Her name in his mouth was a slightly different thing than it was anywhere else, and she registered this with the precise attentiveness of someone who has spent their life listening to intervals. "To finish the debt," she said, steadily, clearly, naming the thing, "and go back to my regular life." He held her gaze. "Is that what you want?" She held his back. "Yes," she said. The beat of silence that followed had a particular architecture, complex, load-bearing. "Then that's what we'll work toward," he said. It was exactly the right thing to say. She knew it as she knew key changes, by feel, by the resolution it brought. She also knew, with the part of herself that processed music beneath language, that they were both lying. The invitation arrived on a Monday, not to her apartment. She had not given that address to anyone connected to Club Aurum, a precaution that had seemed both obvious and perhaps slightly paranoid at the time, and that she was now grateful for. It arrived via Dante, physically, in an envelope of heavy cream stock. She opened it in the green room before Thursday's performance and read it twice. The Caruso Foundation Annual Gala. A charity event, one of the city's largest, benefiting music education programs in public schools. The Broad Theatre on 57th Street. Black tie. And handwritten at the bottom, in an angular, decisive script she recognized without having seen before, "I'd be honored if you would perform. L.C." She read the handwritten line a third time. Then she folded the invitation and put it in her bag, and went out to play Debussy with more force than the Clair de Lune technically required. Afterward, in the lounge, "Tell me about the gala." He was at the bookshelf, replacing a volume. He turned. "It's an annual event. The Foundation funds music programs in 37 public schools in the 5 boroughs. This year's program has a classical performance component." "Why me?" He came to his chair, sat, looked at her with the full weight of that attention. "Because you're the best pianist I know." The simplicity of it, the directness, so unusual for him, so at odds with the careful perimeter of suggestion he usually maintained, caught her off guard. She felt the off-guardedness and filed it away. "It's a public event," she said. "Yes. My name will be on a program associated with the Caruso Foundation is a legitimate organization." His voice was even. "Fully registered, independently audited. The work it does is real. The 37 schools are real." A pause. "I don't require you to be associated with anything other than what the Foundation demonstrably is." She thought about this, about the careful delineation he was drawing between the world above the club and the world below it, between the casino and the Foundation, between what he was and what he wanted her to see. "You keep these things very separate," she said. "I try." "Why?" He looked at her, and something in the look was unusual enough, open enough, that she leaned slightly forward. "Because some things deserve to stay clean," he said, "regardless of what surrounds them." She wasn't sure if he was talking about the Foundation. She said yes to the gala. She told herself it was because the music education work was real and worth her time, and because the exposure would be professionally useful, and because the fee, which Dante had mentioned was generous, would further accelerate the debt resolution. All of these things were true. She told herself they were sufficient. The gala was 3 weeks away. She chose the Beethoven, the Waldstein, the piece she'd been working on since autumn, the piece she'd been preparing for March, but which felt right for this. The Waldstein opened with that single repeated figure, quiet and intense, before it built into something almost overwhelming, and it ended in a coda of such luminous velocity that audiences sometimes forgot to breathe until it finished. It was the right piece. It said something she didn't have words for yet, but recognized as true. In the second week of preparation, Solis appeared at the club on a Tuesday, her off night, as it happened, but she was in the city and had stopped by to use the piano and to pick up a corrected contract Dante had left for her. She encountered Solis in the lobby, both of them apparently surprised, and she remembered what Luca had said. Don't engage beyond pleasantries. Miss Verano, he smiled that practiced smile. A coincidence. Is it? She said pleasantly, and kept walking. She heard him laugh behind her, and the laugh had the particular quality of a man who has just had a question answered that he'd been asking carefully. She didn't know what question. She didn't like that she didn't know. She told Luca about it on Thursday, directly, because she had decided that direct communication was her best tool here, and she intended to use it. He listened with his usual quality of stillness. Then he said, "I'm going to ask you to avoid coming in on off nights." "Because of Solis?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what the issue is?" A pause. He was weighing something. She could see it, the specific quality of a decision being made in real time. "Solis is a partner in certain of my business interests. He's become aware of you. His awareness is—" Another pause. "Inconvenient." "Is he dangerous to me specifically?" "He will be managed." His voice dropped one increment in volume, which she had come to understand as the equivalent in him of emphasis. "I need you to trust that." There it was, the word between them. Trust. "I trust that you'll handle it," she said carefully. "I want you to understand that I'm not asking you to handle it because I'm helpless. I'm asking because it's more efficient." Something in his face shifted, that barely there movement that was his equivalent of significant emotional response. "I understand the distinction," he said. "Good." She picked up her glass. "Now tell me why the Beethoven always sounds different at the hall versus in a smaller space." He picked up his own glass, and the evening moved forward, and somewhere in the room's amber warmth she felt the particular vertigo of a person who is falling and has not yet decided whether to try to stop it. The gala was everything a Caruso Foundation event would be. The Broad Theatre had been transformed, the lobby given over to cocktails, and the kind of elegant social mingling that happened when a room contained enough money to make philanthropy feel like pleasure. The main hall lit with the warm gold of a space designed to be remembered. The stage set simply, with a single piano and a single spotlight. Aria arrived at the artist's entrance alone, having declined the car Dante had offered, and went directly to the stage to check the piano, a 9-foot Hamburg Steinway that was, she noticed with the appreciation of someone whose instrument choices were usually constrained by what was available, impeccably maintained. She played several phrases, made one small adjustment to the bench height, was satisfied. She went to the backstage room that had been set aside for her and changed into the performance dress, the black one, always the black one, but she had added tonight a small pin at the collar, a thing her mother had left, a Baroque-style piece in gold and black onyx that she'd been wearing in performance since she was 22 and which she considered non-negotiable. She checked her hair, looked at herself in the mirror. She had not seen Luca since Thursday. This was normal. They had never interacted outside of the club. But tonight was different from the club, and she was aware of the difference in the particular way you're aware of a change in pressure, a change in atmosphere, the way a musician is aware when a room has become acoustically different from what they prepared for. She heard him before she saw him, his voice in the corridor outside, one side of a brief conversation, measured and low, and then a knock, and then the door opened, and he was standing in the doorframe. She had seen him in evening wear before. He wore suits to the club that were indistinguishable in quality from black tie. But this was different.
The context was different. He was in his world in a different way tonight, publicly, on display, and he wore it the way everything about him was worn, without effort, without apology, with the complete ease of someone who has never needed to perform belonging because belonging was never a question. He looked at her. The look lasted a beat longer than it needed to. "The piano is good?" he asked. "Excellent." She turned back to the mirror. "Your foundation, the music education, is that something you've been involved in from the beginning?" He came a few steps into the room, not close, the middle distance, which had its own particular quality between them now. "My mother was a piano teacher," he said. "Gave lessons out of the house on Bay Street for 30 years. I watched her teach children who had nothing, no money, no stability, nothing, and watched the music give them something that didn't go away." A pause. "It seemed like the most useful thing I could fund." She looked at him in the mirror. He was looking at the floor, and there was something in it, in the looking down, in the slight undercurrent of memory that she found unexpectedly moving. "She sounds like she was remarkable." She was. He looked up, found her eyes in the mirror. "She would have liked your playing." Aria held the eye contact for a moment. Then she turned back to her own reflection, made one small adjustment to the pin at her collar, and said, "I'll be ready in 10 minutes." The performance was one of the best of her life. She understood this even as it was happening, in that split awareness that musicians develop, the part that is inside the music and the part that observes from outside. The Waldstein opened, and she felt the room receive it, that collective intake, and she settled into it the way you settle into a true tempo, the way something clicks into rightness. And she played. She played the first movement with a focused ferocity that surprised even her. The second, that slow, suspended, searching introduzione, with a restraint so precise it was its own form of intensity. And the third movement's rondo, the great rolling coda that Beethoven wrote at the height of his powers, and which seemed, per aria, to be about exactly what she was currently experiencing. The feeling of something moving too fast to stop, gathering velocity, not out of control, but beyond the point where control was the relevant category. She played with everything she had. The last note faded. A beat of absolute silence, then applause, and she rose, and she looked out into the gilded room, and found in the second row just left of centre, Luca Caruso standing. Not applauding with the crowd, but simply standing, watching her, with an expression she had never seen on his face. She held his gaze for 1 second. She looked away first. Afterward, the reception. People she didn't know and people she half recognized, the city's philanthropy circuit, arts administrators, the particular category of wealthy person who wore their generosity as part of their identity. She moved through it with the social grace she'd learned in concert halls, accepting compliments with appropriate warmth, deflecting more personal questions with the pleasantness of someone who has long practice. And then Luca was beside her, not approaching, simply there, the way he sometimes was in the lounge, present without announcement. "They want to book you for next year," he said. "Tell them to call me in January." "I will." He paused. A couple moved past them. He leaned incrementally closer to let them through and didn't fully return to the previous distance afterward. "I need to tell you something." The quality of those words, their weight, their careful preparation, stilled her. "Tell me." "The debt. The original figure Marco borrowed." He looked at her directly. "It's been settled."
She turned fully toward him. Settled how? From the Foundation's accounting, a specific line item. His voice was entirely level, which meant this was something he had decided and would not now be renegotiated. You don't owe me any further performances. The room continued its elegant motion around them. Somewhere a string quartet had begun to play. Aria stood very still and felt the shape of what he was telling her. The full shape of it, what it meant in terms of her freedom, her brother's safety, her life before Club Aurum resuming itself. She also felt something else, something that arrived alongside the relief and was a different temperature entirely. Why? She asked. He looked at her for a long, serious moment. Because I don't want what's between us to be a debt, he said. The string quartet played. The city moved outside the theatre's tall windows. Luca. His name in her mouth for the first time. She heard it herself as she said it, the way it landed, what it cost, what it opened. You can go back to your life, he said. I want you to know that. I know, she held his gaze. What if I don't want to? His expression changed, finally, completely, without the careful governance that usually sat over everything he showed. And she saw what was underneath, what had been underneath for months, and it was not what she'd feared. It was not power or possession or the cold mechanics of control. It was longing, simply, devastatingly, that. She did not go home. She told herself she was going home, had told herself this with the particular firmness she applied to decisions she had already made, a door-closing quality of internal voice that she'd relied on all her adult life. She said goodnight to the Foundation director, and to a woman from the school board, and to 2 other people whose names she'd absorbed and immediately lost in the ambient social pressure of the reception, and she collected her coat from the check and walked toward the door with the full intention of walking out of it and getting a cab and going home to Brooklyn. She found herself at the private elevator instead. She stood in front of it for a moment. The button was a small brass circle, unobtrusive. She pressed it. The elevator arrived. She stepped in, pressed 44. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space she had never been invited to. The penthouse level, Luca's private floor, the space above the casino and the lounge, and all the official architecture of Club Aurum. It was a long moment before she understood what she was looking at, because she had been prepared in some unexamined way for something that matched the rest of the building. The controlled glamour, the carefully managed atmosphere. This was nothing like that. It was a living space that had been arranged by someone who actually lived in it. Books everywhere, overflowing the built-in shelves, stacked on surfaces, one open face down on the arm of a sofa. A kitchen through a doorway that smelled of something. Garlic, she thought. Olive oil, something that had been cooked recently and would again. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, the city spread below in all its impossible illuminated density. And music, not playing, but present the way music is present in a space where it has been heard enough to leave an impression, a quality in the air. And a piano. Smaller than the Steinway downstairs, an upright, old, its veneer worn at the corners, its keys slightly yellowed. It was against one wall, with a lamp beside it, and, on its music stand, a score she recognized at 10 feet. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. She was standing looking at it when she heard the elevator behind her. She turned. Luca stopped when he saw her. He had taken off the jacket of his dinner suit. The white shirt was open at the collar, the bow tie hanging loose. He stood in his own space without the public self-possession that was so natural to him in the club, and what replaced it was something more interior, less arranged, more real. "You stayed," he said. "I pressed the wrong button," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the faintest thing that was not quite a smile, "The penthouse button is 44. The lobby is L. Very dissimilar numbers. Extremely." She turned back to the piano, reached out and touched the top of it lightly, the smooth wood under her fingertips. This was hers. Yes. He crossed the room, not to her, to the kitchen, to the small counter where he poured water for both of them with the ease of someone performing a habitual act. He brought her glass over, set it on the top of the piano. She taught lessons on it for 30 years, and then it came to me, and I kept it. I don't play. But you keep the score on the stand. I read music. I can't perform it. He stood beside her, looking at the piano, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the air between them. Different skills. Entirely different, she agreed. Reading a score is like reading architecture plans. Playing is living in the building. He turned his head and looked at her with an attention so complete it was almost tactile. She held it. "Play something," he said. She looked at the upright, at the worn keys, at the Bach score. "You want me to play your mother's piano?" "I've wanted to hear you play it since I brought you downstairs for your second visit." He said it simply, without self-consciousness, the way he said the things he'd decided to say. "If you're willing." She sat down on the bench. It was lower than she was accustomed to, and she adjusted and put her hands on the keys and felt the resistance of them. Heavier than the Steinway, the mechanism older, the response more effortful, which meant more honest. This was a piano that didn't allow shortcuts. She played the prelude in C major, the first prelude of the Well-Tempered Clavier, the most transparent thing Bach ever wrote, 16 bars of arpeggiated simplicity that contained more beauty than most composers achieved in a lifetime. She played it slowly, not the way she'd play it in a recital, but the way she'd play it alone, without performance, just the notes and what they were. When she finished, she sat with her hands in her lap. Luca was sitting on the arm of the sofa that was close to the piano, and he had his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely linked, and he was looking at her with that expression she had seen at the gala, the one without the governance, the one that showed what was underneath. "Why did you settle the debt?" she asked, into the space that the prelude had made, where honesty was easier. "I told you. I want to hear you say it again." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I want you here because you want to be here, not because you have to be." He held her gaze. "The first is everything. The second is nothing. I don't want nothing." She looked at him, at this man who ran a world built on leverage and consequence and the precision of knowing what people owed, who had voluntarily relinquished the one piece of leverage he had over her. "That's a significant disadvantage to accept," she said, strategically. "Yes. A beat. I'm aware." She stood up, crossed the room to him, stopped when she was close. close enough that the distance was personal, was deliberate. She looked up at him because he was taller and because she wanted to see his face from here. "I'm going to need you to be honest with me," she said, "about everything that's relevant. Not everything. I'm not asking you to hand me a ledger, but the things that touch my life and my brother's life. Can you do that?" "Yes. And I need to not be managed. I'm here because I choose to be, and I'm choosing with full information, and if the information changes, I choose again. That's how it works for me." "I understand." "Do you?" He reached up and touched her face. Once, lightly, a single gesture with the backs of his fingers along her cheekbone, the most careful thing, the kind of touch that is entirely a question. "Yes," he said, "I do." She closed the remaining distance. She woke early, which she always did. The quality of light through the east-facing windows of the penthouse was different from Brooklyn. Higher, more open, the sun arriving without the mediation of neighbouring buildings. She lay still for a moment, in the particular consciousness of a person waking somewhere unfamiliar, in the half-second before context assembled itself. And then it did, and she was awake, fully, holding the fact of where she was and how she'd arrived here, and what she felt about it. She felt, she took careful inventory, clear. Not the clarity of a decision regretted and rationalized, but the simpler, less complicated clarity of something that had been true for a while and had finally been said. Luca was already awake. She could hear him in another room, the low sound of a voice, someone on the phone, quiet and clipped. She lay in his bed in the early light and listened to the sound of him managing the world from wherever he managed it from, and the domesticity of it was strange and strangely comfortable. She got up, found a shirt, his, left on a chair, put it on. Found the kitchen, which was smaller than she'd expected for the space, and found coffee, which was exactly the quality she'd have guessed, and made it while looking out at the city doing its morning thing, 44 floors below. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, jacket still on from last night, phone in hand, looking at her with an expression of faint, careful surprise, as if the visual of her standing in his kitchen, in his shirt, was something he was filing carefully. "You found the coffee?" "I can always find the coffee." She poured a second cup. Held it out. "Who were you talking to?" He took the cup. "Dante." "Early." "Dante doesn't sleep." He drank, leaned against the counter. "Solis is leaving the city today, returning to Caracas." She looked at him over her cup. That was efficient. "The business relationship has been restructured." His voice was level. She understood what restructured meant in this context and did not ask for elaboration. "He won't be at the club." "Is that because of me?" "Partly." He held her gaze. "I told you I would handle it." "You did." She set down her cup. "Luca, I need you to understand that I can't be the reason you make operational decisions. That's a kind of cost I'm not willing to carry." He was quiet for a moment, and what she saw in his face was something she had begun to identify as his version of openness. Not warm in the demonstrative way, but present, without armour, without the professional remove. "Solis was becoming a liability that had nothing to do with you," he said. "You accelerated a timeline. That's different from being the cause." She held this, tested it for truth, the way she tested a new piece, not performing it, just touching it, feeling the weight of it. All right. Are you angry? No. She picked up her cup again. I'm calibrating. Something in him settled, a small, barely visible release of something held. You do that. Often? Constantly. He moved to the window. The city was waking in its pieces below them. The river traffic, the early pedestrians, the opening of gates and storefronts, the whole complicated, ordinary life of 10 million people who had nothing to do with this apartment or its occupants. I find it... He paused. His hesitations were still unusual enough that she attended to them. I find it one of the things I admire most about you. She joined him at the window. They stood with 2 feet between them, looking at the city, and the morning held them in its pale gold light. And she thought about how strange it was, the way life made its arrangements. The chain of events from Marco's debt to this window, this morning, this man. She was not someone who believed in the romantic logic of everything for a reason. She believed in causation, in consequence, in the honest mechanics of how one thing led to another. And yet there was something in the standing here that felt, if not inevitable, then at least correct, like a resolution that had been earned through dissonance. I'm teaching at 10, she said. I need to go home and change. The car. I'll take the subway. He turned his head. Arya. I will always take the subway, she said pleasantly. This is not a negotiable point. The thing that was not quite a smile arrived on his face with its characteristic reticence. The car will be available if you want it. That's very kind. She set down her cup and turned and went to find her dress. He didn't follow, which she appreciated. He gave her the space to collect herself and her things, and when she came back through the living room, he was in the kitchen making what appeared to be toast, with the focused attention of a man who brings seriousness to everything he does. And she stood for a moment in the doorway, watching him, and felt a quiet, uncomplicated tenderness that she hadn't felt in years. Thursday, she said. He turned from the toast. I'll be here. She went to the elevator. The doors opened. She stepped in and pressed the lobby button, the correct one, and as the doors closed, she caught one last glimpse of his kitchen, of him standing there in last night's shirt, with his coffee and his toast. And she smiled at the elevator doors the whole way down. Dante Ferrara had worked for Luca Caruso for 9 years. In that time, he had witnessed a significant inventory of events and had developed, out of professional necessity and genuine respect, a finely calibrated understanding of the man he served. He knew Luca's tolerances and his limits. He knew the specific quality of a silence that meant displeasure versus a silence that meant thought, versus a silence that meant something was about to happen. He knew, because his survival had at various points depended on this, the exact moment Luca Caruso had decided something. He had known about the Pianist approximately 6 weeks before Luca would have acknowledged it. Dante was not sentimental. He was, however, observant, and what he observed was this. Luca was easier in the days after Thursday, not happy in any way that would have been recognizable to a casual observer. The external presentation was unchanged, as controlled and precise as ever,
But Dante was not a casual observer. He was someone who had spent 9 years in close proximity to this man, and he noticed things like the fact that Luca ate more on Fridays, that the early morning phone calls, the operational ones, the ones that dealt with the kind of problems that had to be solved before dawn, were handled with slightly less of the cold economy that was their usual register. He noticed, most significantly, that Luca was being careful. This was the part that made Dante thoughtful. Luca was always careful in professional matters. That quality was so fundamental to him, it was invisible, like breathing. But this was different. This was a specific kind of care, directed outward, protective. The way a person carries something fragile with the extra attention of someone aware that they are holding something that could be damaged by ordinary handling. He understood what this meant. It made him, in a purely practical sense, alert, because it changed certain calculations. The kinds of people who paid attention to Luca Caruso's vulnerabilities were not hypothetical. And a vulnerability was easier to identify when it had a face and a name and a performance schedule posted 3 nights a week on the club's internal calendar. He had handled Solace efficiently. That particular problem was resolved. The problem that kept Dante thoughtful was more structural. He waited until a Wednesday in late November, when the city had gone cold and grey outside, and the club was doing its slow-day business below, and he went up to the office on the 43rd floor, where Luca kept the actual operational business of his empire, and knocked, and went in. Luca was at his desk, real work. The kind that would have looked, to an uninitiated observer, like the operations of a legitimate and complex private equity structure, because that was, largely, what it also was. "Finetti is making noise," Dante said, setting a folder on the desk, "about the West Side arrangement." Luca opened the folder. "He's been making noise about the West Side arrangement for 2 years. The noise is louder this month." Dante sat. "He's heard about the changes with Solis." "Let him hear." Luca closed the folder, looked up. "That's not what you came up here to tell me." Dante looked at his boss, at the face that had been for 9 years the most consistent thing in a landscape that was, by nature, inconsistent. "Finetti will try to find leverage," he said. "That's his pattern. When he's uncomfortable, he looks for something to hold." A pause. The quality of Luca's stillness deepened by one increment. "I know," Luca said. "She's public now. After the gala, her name is on the Foundation's materials." He said this as a fact, without editorializing, because that was how he operated. Finetti has people who read things. Luca was quiet for a long moment. "What are you recommending?" "I'm not recommending anything. I'm telling you what I know." Dante stood. "You'll make the decision you'll make. I just want to make sure you've considered the exposure." "I've considered it." "And?" Luca looked at him with those dark, still eyes that Dante had spent 9 years learning to read. And what he read now was, as he had suspected, not surprise, not alarm, something more deliberate, the expression of someone who has already mapped the territory ahead and chosen their path through it. "She's not a vulnerability," Luca said. "She's a reason to remove threats more efficiently." Dante absorbed this. That's a different frame. It's the correct frame. Dante went to the door, stopped. He had never been a man who offered personal observations in professional contexts. It wasn't his style, and it wasn't his role. But 9 years had built something between them that wasn't exactly friendship and wasn't exactly not. And sometimes the 9 years spoke for itself. "She's good for you," he said, looking at the door rather than at Luca. "I say that as a data point." A long silence, then, "I know." Dante left. On the other side of the city, Aria was teaching. Her 10 o'clock was a 17-year-old named Priya, who had more technical facility than imagination and was, in Aria's considered opinion, on the verge of becoming either a very good pianist or a very good musician, and the difference between those two things was going to be determined in the next 2 or 3 years by whether she learned to feel the music she played or simply to execute it. Today, Priya was working through the Moonlight Sonata and playing it the way most technically accomplished students played it, accurately, cleanly, beautifully empty. "Stop," Aria said. Priya stopped. "What is this piece about?" Priya blinked. The first movement is in the style of a funeral march, and Beethoven was—" "No, not the biography, not the musicology." Aria came to stand beside the piano. "What is it about? To you? Right now, at 17, in November?" Priya was quiet. "Something is keeping you from going inside it," Aria said, not unkindly. "I can hear you playing at the piece rather than through it. That's not a technical problem. What's the thing you're not letting yourself feel?" Priya looked at her hands, very quietly, after a moment. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of playing it wrong, of doing it badly, of it being too—" She stopped. "Of showing something." Aria sat down on the bench beside her student. "Play it again," she said, "and be wrong. Play it badly. Show everything." She looked at the girl's profile. "The piece can hold whatever you put into it. So can I." Priya played, and 4 phrases in, something opened, some interior door, some permission extended and accepted, and the Moonlight Sonata arrived in the room the way it was supposed to, imperfect and entirely real. And Aria sat beside her and felt the old simple wonder of music moving through a person, and thought, not for the first time, that this was the thing she always came back to. This was what the debt and the casino and the complicated mathematics of the last several months had never been able to touch. The call came on a Tuesday. Aria was in the middle of her own practice, the Sonata Opus 111, Beethoven's last piano sonata, which she'd been circling for years without committing to performing, because it was one of those pieces that required a kind of reckoning she hadn't felt ready for. When her phone vibrated, she ignored it. It vibrated again. A third time. She stopped playing, looked at the screen, 4 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and then a text from Marco. "Call me. Now. Please." She called. Marco answered on the first ring, which told her everything about his current state. "There's a man," he said without preamble. "He came to my apartment this morning." Cold settled in her chest, clean and functional. "Are you safe?" "Yes. He was polite. He left." Marco's voice had the particular quality of someone who had been frightened and was now performing calm and doing it badly. "He said to tell you that certain people are interested in your current," and this is the word he used, Aria, "arrangement, and that they wanted to make sure you understood that your arrangement had an audience." "Finetti," she said.
The name had arrived in her consciousness over the past weeks, through the oblique grammar of things Luca didn't directly say, through context, through the particular quality of Dante's watchfulness. I don't know his name. A beat. Is this bad? It's a message, she said. Her voice was steady. She had discovered in the past months that she was better at this particular steadiness than she'd known, that the part of her that regulated emotion under performance pressure could be applied to other varieties of threat. Don't go anywhere today. I'll call you back. She hung up. Sat very still for a moment. Then she called the number Dante had given her for emergencies, which she had never used and had hoped never to use. Dante answered. She told him concisely what Marco had reported. I'll take care of it, Dante said. Don't alter your schedule. I want to speak to Luca. A pause. He's unavailable until this evening. Tell him I need to speak to him today. She kept her voice level. Before this evening. Another pause, shorter. I'll pass that on. He called back in 20 minutes. Not Dante. Luca. Are you all right? First words. Yes. She stood up, moved to the window of her apartment. The street below was ordinary and indifferent, and she gripped that ordinariness like a railing. Marco's okay. It was a message. I know what it was. His voice had its operational quality, very even, very specific, the tone she associated with decisions being made rather than reported. I'm sorry this reached him. Is he in danger? Not anymore. We've addressed the situation. A beat. I should have moved faster on Finetti. Tell me what addressed means. A pause. She could hear him considering how to answer this in the grammar of honesty he'd agreed to. It means he's been reminded of the specific costs of involving people outside this organization in matters that concern this organization. His voice didn't change, but beneath the level tone was something she heard clearly, a coldness that was not cruelty, but was absolutely unambiguous. He will not contact Marco again. And me? You were never the target. You were the medium. She heard him move, a door somewhere on his end. He wanted me to feel exposed. Do you? A pause with a different quality than his thinking pauses, loaded. Yes, he said, but not in the way he intended. She turned from the window. The Sonata Opus 111 lay open on the piano stand, Beethoven's last word on the piano, his farewell to the form that had occupied 40 years of his life, written when he was entirely deaf and entirely committed to saying the thing he most needed to say. I need you to hear something, she said. Tell me. I'm not going to live in the middle of your operations as if I'm invisible to the people who want to use me as a message. That's not sustainable. So either we find a way to address that, or... She stopped. Then, or we find a way to address it, she said, again differently, without the implied alternative. But I need it to be something we decide together. A longer pause than usual. I was going to propose something similar, he said. What? Moving you, temporarily. The penthouse is... He stopped. A very small, very precise stop. It's more secure, and it would be more visible, an overt choice, not a covert one. That's actually better protection than trying to keep things obscure. She understood what he was saying, what it would mean, what it would look like, and to whom, and what it would change. You're asking me to move in with you.
I'm telling you it's the safest option. A beat. I'm also asking you to move in with me. She looked at the sonata on the stand. Beethoven, deaf and mortal and certain, writing his last work for the piano. The second movement was a kind of transcendence. It moved beyond the sonata form itself into something open, something that had no boundaries, that ended not with resolution, but with pure tone, pure light, a D major chord that simply sustained until it was gone, and left only the space it had illuminated. "I'll need to bring the Ravel scores," she said. A pause. Then, "Bring whatever you need. And I'm not giving up the conservatory position. I never asked you to. And the subway." Aria. "Fine," she said. "The car. Sometimes." She heard it then, very clearly, unambiguously, for the first time. The sound of Luca Caruso laughing. Not a performer's laugh, not the polite approximation of amusement. A real laugh, quiet and low and startled out of him, and it transformed the sound of his voice the way light transforms a room. And she stood in her Brooklyn apartment in the November afternoon and felt something in her chest go open and stay that way. Moving, it turned out, was a metaphysical act as much as a practical one. Aria owned less than she had expected, a fact that surprised her slightly, because she had been in the apartment on Hoyt Street for 4 years and had assumed the accumulation of time would have generated the accumulation of things. Instead, she found, packing on a Thursday morning while Luca's driver waited downstairs with appropriate patience and an absolutely massive vehicle, that most of what she owned was music. Scores, filling 2 large shelving units, organized by composer and period with the precision of a taxonomist. CDs she no longer needed and kept anyway. Recordings on hard drives. The notebook she'd kept since conservatory school. Not a diary, more a practice journal, full of annotations and questions, and the occasional revelation written in the cramped, sideways script she used when she was thinking faster than she was writing. And then the things that were not music. The photograph of her parents, taken the summer before her mother died, both of them squinting into the sun on a beach in New Jersey, with the particular ease of people who haven't yet imagined their own future losses. Marco's drawing from when he was 6, given to Aria at 8. A horse that was recognizably a horse only because it was labelled horse. The pin, the Baroque one, wrapped in its small cloth and kept in the drawer of the nightstand. A coffee mug from the Vienna Philharmonic that she'd bought in the gift shop after a concert, and that had, against all logic and the mug's undistinguished design, become her specific and irreplaceable mourning vessel. She left the furniture. She arrived at the penthouse on a grey Thursday afternoon with 4 boxes and 2 rolling suitcases and the particular expression of someone who has made a decision and intends to inhabit it without apology. Dante met her in the lobby, not the club entrance, but a separate residential entrance on the building's west side that she hadn't known existed, and rode up with her in the elevator and helped carry 2 boxes without comment, and then disappeared with the discreet efficiency she had come to associate with him. Luca was not there when she arrived. He had warned her of this, a meeting that couldn't be moved, he'd said, and she had told him she didn't need to be received, and had meant it. She walked through the penthouse with new eyes, the eyes of someone who was now going to live in it, and therefore needed to understand it differently. It was larger than she'd registered in her previous visits, a full floor of the building, the kitchen and main living spaces on the south side,
a study on the east, a bedroom on the north with the river view, a second bedroom that was currently empty in the way of rooms that have been kept ready for something unnamed. She stood in its doorway for a moment, then went to put her things in the main bedroom because the semantics of a separate room felt like a performance of caution she was no longer in the business of. She unpacked her scores first, then the photograph, then the Vienna mug, which she placed in the kitchen cabinet, and as she did, the gesture had a finality that she felt in her hands, the placing of a specific thing in a specific place, as a kind of quiet declaration. She was arranging her practice space. She'd identified a corner of the living room where the light was good and where the upright piano created a natural centre, when she heard the elevator. Luca came in, carrying a bag from what appeared to be a grocery store. He stopped when he saw the scores arranged on the floor and the photograph on the shelf and the coffee mug visible through the open cabinet door. And his face did the thing, the small, significant move beneath the surface. And then he looked at her. "I made a start," she said. He set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter. "I thought I'd cook." She looked at the bag. "You cook?" "I cook reasonably. My mother's recipes. I never learned anything original." He began removing items from the bag with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Fresh pasta, she noted, garlic, a bottle of something good. She said cooking from a recipe was reading sheet music. You had to learn it well enough to play it without looking. Aria leaned against the kitchen door frame. That's exactly right. She was usually right. She watched him work for a moment, the easy competence of it, the way his hands moved with the same economical precision they brought to everything, and thought about what it meant to be shown someone's private self. Not the deliberate revelation, but the incidental one, the glimpse you get when a person is simply doing something, unperforming, unguarded. She went to the piano and played while he cooked. Nothing programmed, nothing intentional. The kind of playing she did when she needed to think without language, following one phrase to another by harmonic gravity, by the logic of what each moment wanted to go to next. She played for perhaps 20 minutes, and when she stopped, the apartment smelled of garlic and wine, and something she identified, after a moment, as the smell of being somewhere that was becoming home. They ate at the table by the east window, with the city going dark around them, and Luca told her about his mother's house on Bay Street, the kitchen that was the centre of everything. The way the neighbourhood had been then, the particular cultural gravity of his father's world, and the way his mother had maintained her own gravity alongside it, distinct and undiminished. He spoke about her with a directness he didn't use about most things, and Aria listened and understood that this was what he was offering her, the actual interior, the real history, the self before the architecture of control had been built around it. "She knew what your father did," Aria said. "She knew everything." He turned his glass. She chose it. That mattered to her, that it was a choice, not an inheritance. A pause. She chose him, not what he was. She always said there was a difference. Aria looked at him across the table. She sounds like someone who understood complexity. She understood it better than he did, better than I do. He looked at his glass. She used to say that the line between a man and his work was the most important line to hold, that you could do hard things in the world and still keep a clean interior, that the interior was the part that mattered. Do you believe that? He looked up. I'm trying to. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, briefly, a single contact, and took her hand back. He looked at the place where her hand had been for a moment, then at her, and the look held everything that didn't need to be said yet. "The pasta was excellent," she said. "My mother's recipe. I'd like it again sometime." He smiled. The full version. The real one that she had now seen 3 times and that transformed his entire face. The one that made him look, briefly, younger and less governed and entirely himself. "Thursdays," he said. "Thursdays," she agreed. He made his move in December. Aria found out about it the same way she had found out about most things in this period. Not from the direct source, not through official channels, but from the side. A conversation fragment she wasn't meant to overhear. A silence at the breakfast table that had a specific shape. A phone call Luca took in the study with the door closed and stayed in the study after. Not in the way of someone finishing work, but in the way of someone thinking. She waited until evening. They were on the sofa. She had been reading, he had been reviewing documents, the easy, parallel company posture that had developed between them in the weeks she'd been here, the comfortable coexistence of 2 people who didn't need to perform their togetherness. She set her book down. "Tell me about Finetti." He looked up. His expression didn't change, which she'd learned to read as the precursor to a decision about honesty. "What do you already know?" "That something happened? That it's been occupying you for 3 days?" She kept her voice steady. "Tell me." He set down his documents, turned toward her with the full attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. "He's reached out to a prosecutor," he said. "A federal connection. He's offered information in exchange for protection." She held this. "Information about you." "About the structure of certain of my operations." He paused. "And he suggested that the performance arrangement at the club and the change in your residential situation constitute evidence of a coercive relationship." His voice was very controlled. Beneath it she heard something that was not anger, but was adjacent to it, something cold and deliberate. "He's arguing that you're in a compromised position." Aria was quiet for a moment. "He's using me to get to you." "Yes." "By making it look like you're using me." "Yes." She stood up, walked to the window. The December city below was wearing its cold weather self, lit harder, more interior, the streets less populated, but more intentional. She looked at it and sorted through what she was feeling with the same precision she brought to everything. Anger, yes, clean and clarifying. Fear, some, but the functional kind, the kind that sharpened rather than paralyzed. And underneath both, the particular fury of a person whose autonomy has been used as a weapon against them. "He doesn't understand something," she said. "What's that?" She turned. "He thinks I'm a liability. He thinks being connected to me makes you vulnerable because it creates a pressure point, someone you'll do things to protect, someone who can be framed as a victim. That's his calculation. It's wrong." She came back to the sofa, sat down and looked at him with the directness that was, by now, the only mode she operated in with him. "I'm not a victim. I came here. I made the decision. Not under duress. The debt was settled before I made any personal choices. This is my life, my choice." She paused. "I want to talk to the prosecutor." Luca went very still. No. Hear me out. Arya, I said, hear me out. She held his gaze with the steady, unflinching quality that she brought to a difficult passage, not forcing, not fighting, but meeting resistance with equal and precise firmness. A voluntary statement. I chose this. I can say that clearly and legally and on the record. I was performing at the club under a contract. The contract was concluded, and I chose to maintain a personal relationship. That's it. That's the whole story. She let a beat pass. He's building a case on the premise that I'm not here freely.
The easiest way to destroy that premise is for me to say so. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the calculation, the risk, the exposure, the implications. She could see him arriving, as he always did, at the honest answer. It puts you in proximity to this. I'm already in proximity to this. I live here. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going to pretend I don't, and I'm not going to let someone else write the story of my choices for their own purposes. A silence. The quality of it was specific, the silence of someone recognizing something they hadn't fully seen before. He reached out and touched her hand, her wrist, the inside of it where the pulse was. You're extraordinary, he said quietly, not as a compliment, as a recognition. I'm practical, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The legal process was what it was, slow, procedural, expensive in the currency of time and attention and the specific anxiety of being witnessed by institutions that had, she was fully aware, reasons of their own to see the story in a particular way. Arya gave her statement. She was precise and direct and used words she had chosen carefully, and the prosecutor, a young woman who looked at her with an expression that contained both professional skepticism and genuine curiosity, wrote things down and asked follow-up questions and said at the end, "You understand that the nature of this relationship will be subject to scrutiny." "All relationships are subject to scrutiny," Arya said. "This one is simply on the record." The prosecutor looked at her for a moment. Then, "Thank you for your time, Miss Verano." Arya's statement did not resolve the Finetti situation completely. Nothing in Luca's world resolved completely, she was learning. Things moved and shifted and were managed, but rarely concluded. But it changed the architecture of it. It removed the specific leverage Finetti had thought he had. And it did something else, something she hadn't fully anticipated. It made clear to the prosecutor, to Finetti's people, and perhaps most importantly to Luca himself, that she was not standing beside him by accident or by compulsion. She was standing beside him because she had chosen to stand there. In the car riding back to the penthouse after the meeting, Luca was quiet for several blocks. Then he said, "I had a plan for Finetti that didn't involve you." "I know. It would have taken longer. I know that too." He looked at her. Outside, the city passed in its grey December light. "Why?" he asked. She thought about it, gave him the honest answer, which was the only kind she gave him. "Because I'm not someone who lets other people narrate her life," she said, "even when the narrative is favourable." She looked out the window, "Even when they're trying to help." He was quiet. Then, "You are protecting yourself. And you." She turned her head. "Both." He reached over and took her hand, said nothing, held it the rest of the ride home. Christmas came to the penthouse in the particular way that it came to people whose relationship with celebration was complicated by history. Luca did not decorate. She had gathered this from the bare quality of the space in early December, from the absence of any holiday objects, from the way he'd looked when she'd mentioned, in passing, that she wanted a tree. A small one, practical, nothing elaborate, and he had looked at her with the expression of someone confronted with something they had genuinely not considered, as if the idea had never occurred to him and was now occurring to him for the first time in his adult life. "My mother did," he said. "After she died, it stopped." She had gone and found a small Douglas fir in a lot on 10th Avenue and brought it home in a cab with the driver's patient assistance and the particular problem-solving energy of someone who was going to do a thing and wasn't going to make a production of the doing. She found a stand, improvised one from a large pot and some stones, and put the tree in the corner by the upright piano. She had no ornaments. She made some, badly, from materials she found in the kitchen. Strips of newspaper folded into shapes that were impressionistic approximations of stars. A string of dried orange slices that Luca watched her make with an expression she had decided to classify, for her own amusement, as bewildered fondness. "You're making ornaments from orange peels," he said. "They smell good." She placed one on a branch. "Come, help." He did not, initially, help. He stood near the tree with his arms crossed and watched her, and then he reached out and adjusted one of the newspaper stars so it hung straight. And then he was helping, in his particular way, not the effusive way, not with commentary or enthusiasm, but with the focused care he brought to everything, each adjustment deliberate and precise. When the tree was done, she stood back and looked at it. It was deeply imperfect. It was, she thought, exactly right. He stood beside her looking at it, and his face had that interior quality, the ungoverned one, the one she treasured. "My mother would have found this completely inadequate," he said. "How did she decorate?" "Every surface, lights everywhere, a very large angel at the top of the tree that she'd had since childhood." He was quiet. "She made the kitchen into a kind of production facility for 2 weeks before Christmas. Cookies and pastries, the whole house smelled like sugar and anise." A pause. "I haven't thought about that in a long time." She took his hand. He let her. They stood there in the quiet of the penthouse with the small, imperfect tree between them and the city outside the windows, doing its vast, indifferent business. And she thought about the ground that holds, about the baseline that doesn't move while everything above it changes, about what it means to find something that stays. Marco came for Christmas Eve. She had not been certain until he arrived how this would go. Marco meeting Luca, the two sides of her life in the same room, all the complicated history of the past year, making the air between them weighted in ways that were difficult to predict. Marco had known by now the full picture. She had told him gradually over the fall, in pieces that she judged him ready to hold, and he had processed it with the unsteadiness that was characteristic of him, going through a sequence of responses that included denial, guilt, a brief and fairly spectacular display of misplaced protectiveness, and then, finally, the kind of simple acceptance that Marco arrived at when he'd exhausted his other options. What she hadn't fully predicted was this. Marco walked in, looked at Luca, and said, without apparent subtext, "You have an incredible piano downstairs. Aria doesn't stop talking about it." Luca looked at her. She kept her expression neutral. "She's welcome to play it whenever she likes," Luca said. "She does," Marco said. "Trust me." He grinned. The Marco grin.
That unguarded, entirely uncalculated charm that was the best version of him. You have a good place. It smells like that tree. It's a recent addition. She makes everything smell better. Our apartment growing up, she used to practice and the music just changed everything, like the air got better. Luca looked at her again, with a quality so specific and so private that she felt it physically. The evening went better than she had planned for, which she took as evidence of something she was still learning, that the things she most worried about were often the ones that arrived most gently. Marco was funny and genuine, and when he shook Luca's hand at the end of the night, there was a quality to the handshake that said something she would have needed music rather than words to accurately name. After Marco left, Luca stood in the kitchen washing glasses, an insistence she had stopped arguing with. The man would wash dishes while caterers stood idle, and she sat on the counter the way she'd started doing in these domestic months, close enough to talk, comfortable enough not to need to. "He's different from you," Luca said. "Entirely. He loves you very much." "Yes." She watched his hands in the water. "He's doing better. The therapy." She paused. "He said something to me last week, that he's been carrying around the idea that he was supposed to be as good as I am at something, and that the weight of it was what kept making him look for shortcuts." She turned her coffee mug, the Vienna one. "He said he thinks he's finally ready to just be whatever he is instead." Luca dried his hands, turned, looked at her with that full, unhurried attention. How did that feel to hear? Like something being set down. She met his eyes. Like relief. A kind I didn't know I was waiting for. He crossed to her, to the counter, stopped in front of her. She was at his height there, eye level, and she looked at him from very close, at the face that had become, over months of careful proximity, one of the most familiar things she knew. "I have something for you," he said. He produced from somewhere, a pocket, she wasn't sure, a small box, not wrapped, just a box. She opened it. A key. A spare key to the penthouse, and attached to it a small card in his handwriting. "In case you forget which button to press." She laughed. She laughed until she had to lean her forehead against his shoulder, and he held her there and laughed too, quietly, and the tree smelled like orange peel and Douglas fir, and the city sang its low note 44 floors below. February brought her back to Carnegie Hall. It was not, in its origin, a performance she'd planned. The engagement had been booked 2 years earlier, one of those acts of optimism that performing artists do, booking dates in the future, with the faith that the future will cooperate, that circumstances will align, that the person you are when the date arrives will be capable of the performance the date requires. What she hadn't known when she'd booked it was what the intervening 2 years would contain. She stood in the wings of Stern Auditorium on a Thursday evening in February in her black dress with the Baroque pin, and held the particular quality of silence that exists in that specific waiting space, the backstage silence of Carnegie Hall, which she had learned at 22 and recognized now like an old room, familiar in its bones. Somewhere on the other side of the curtain, 2,800 people were finding their seats, their conversation a low, continuous sound like weather. She was playing the Sonata Opus 111. She had decided this in November, quietly and without announcement, had told her booking agent to put the Beethoven on the program,
and had said nothing else about it. She had been preparing it since before Club Aurum, since before the debt, since before all of it, circling it for years, with the awareness that it demanded something she needed to be sure she had. Beethoven's last statement, the piece that moved beyond the sonata form in its second movement and arrived somewhere that wasn't categorizable, not resolution, not transcendence, something more honest than either. Something like acceptance, like the ground holding beneath a piece that no longer needed to prove anything. She was ready for it now. In the third row of the orchestra section, Luca sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the stage. He had been to Carnegie Hall before, had attended performances here across his adult life, always with the appreciation of someone for whom music was a genuine value, not a performed sophistication. He had never sat in the audience the way he was sitting now, which was with the specific quality of someone whose relationship to what they were about to witness had changed the nature of their witnessing. Dante was 2 seats away. This had been Luca's only concession to the professional context. He had not brought more than that. He had dressed as he dressed for anything that mattered, and sat in the third row and waited. The house lights went down. She walked onto the stage. He watched her cross to the piano, that walk, the particular quality of her posture, the way she inhabited the stage, the same way she inhabited any room, without performance, but without diminishment. And something in him that had been very carefully maintained for a very long time, simply, quietly, released. She sat. She placed her hands. She played the first movement. He had heard her play hundreds of times now, by calculation, in the casino and the lounge and the penthouse, and in the recording he kept on his phone and listened to at 3 in the morning, when sleep was an abstraction. He knew her playing the way he knew her face, in its details and its wholeness, in the specific qualities that made it hers and no one else's. This was different. This was the thing in its full amplitude, in the space built for it. The Beethoven pouring out of her and filling the hall, not loud, not demonstrative, but present in a way that made the room larger and smaller at the same time, that compressed 2,800 separate humans into a single, held breath. He watched and listened and felt, in the middle of the first movement's development, the full weight of the last year arrive all at once. The night she had first walked into his casino, the Revel, the early weeks of careful professional remove, the conversations in the lounge, the morning in his kitchen, the gala, the legal meeting, the Christmas tree made of orange peel, the whole accumulated architecture of what had, against all his careful intentions, become the most significant thing in his life. The first movement ended. A pause. The second movement began. The Arietta. It started with a simple, bare theme, major key, entirely exposed, the kind of melody that strips away everything that isn't essential and leaves only what it means. And then Beethoven took it through a set of variations of increasing intensity, increasing complexity, always returning to the theme, but each time more luminous, each time further inside its own meaning, until in the final variation, the music became something that was barely music anymore and was entirely music, sound at its most transparent, at the edge of silence, and then silence itself. He sat in the third row and felt the tear arrive, and sat with it without moving, in the stillness that was his nature, and let the music do what only music could do. The last chord faded. 2,800 people held the silence for one collective second. Then the hall erupted. She stood, took her bow. Her face, in profile from where he sat, had that open quality, the Arietta quality, the thing that happened to her face when she had played entirely honestly and had nothing left to hold back. She looked out at the hall with her eyes full and her chin up and her hands loose at her sides. He was already standing. Backstage, afterward, through the door, through the corridor, through the specific geography of backstage Carnegie Hall, he found her standing at the window of her dressing room, still in her dress, still in the pins, with her back to the door. She turned when he came in. He crossed the room. He put his hands on her face, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the Arietta hadn't already said. And she reached up and covered his hands with hers, and stood there in the fluorescent light of a Carnegie Hall dressing room, and held on. "The ground held," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it did." She pressed her forehead to his, and they stood there among the flowers people had brought, and the smell of someone's perfume, and the distant sound of the audience still moving through the lobby, and the city waited outside, and the music was all around them, in the way that music stays in a room after it has been played, not audible, but present, the echo of something true that the walls keep for a while before they let it go. Spring came. It came in the way it always comes to cities, incrementally, almost argumentatively, taking back cold days as soon as they were relinquished, then granting a morning so warm and green and impossible that the whole enterprise of winter seemed retroactively overstated. Arya noticed it from the penthouse windows, from the conservatory courtyard, from the subway platforms where the underground air began to smell of something other than cold iron. She noticed it from the balcony off the penthouse that she had claimed in mid-March as a practice space of a different kind, somewhere to sit in the morning with coffee and the score she was working toward, somewhere to be outside without being in the city, which was its own useful distinction. She was preparing a recording. Not the first of her career. She had 2 albums, recorded in her late 20s, which she was proud of in the way you're proud of work done honestly at a time when honesty was the best you had. This one would be different. She had a label interested, a small, serious one, the kind that cared about the music and the person making it and had no expectation of selling 100,000 units. And the program she was planning was the most personally revealing thing she had ever considered committing to record. The Goldbergs, the Waldstein, the Opus 111. And, at the end, Satie's Gymnopédies, those 3 pieces she had played on her first real night at Club Aurum, the ones that had opened the room's attention like a window being lifted. She told Luca about the program on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table over coffee. He listened with his particular attending quality, the one she had spent months studying and still found inexhaustible. "Why the Satie at the end?" he asked. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Because that's where it started. That's the music that was playing when I understood that this—" She gestured, a gesture that encompassed the kitchen, the city, the whole year, all of it. "When I understood that something was happening that I hadn't expected." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "When did you know?" "Know what?" "That you were staying. Not the debt, not the arrangement." He looked at her steadily. "When did you know you were staying?" She considered this carefully, because it deserved care, because the precision of the answer mattered. "The Goldbergs," she said. That Thursday, when I played them for the room and then came up afterward and you said that I was actually in the room, not in the piece, in the room. She looked at him. Because you understood the distinction. Because that was the thing I'd never been able to explain to anyone, and you just named it. He looked at his coffee cup. The expression on his face was the interior one, the real one. I knew before that, he said. How before? The first night, he looked up. When you turned your head toward the mezzanine at the end of the first piece, you couldn't see me, but you knew exactly where I was. A pause. No one had ever done that before. No one had ever paid attention in that particular direction. I felt you watching. I know. He set down his cup. That was when. She looked at him. This man, who had, in the calculus of a world she had not chosen and had not entirely left, done things she didn't ask about and couldn't fully reconcile, and had decided, on the basis of all the evidence she had of who he actually was, to trust. Not blindly, not without clear eyes, but with the trust of someone who has heard the ground and knows it holds. The debt is gone, she said. It has been. Marco is better. Steadily. Finetti is managed. She nodded, drank her coffee. Outside, the balcony caught the first real spring sunlight of the year, warm and specific, the kind that makes you squint and doesn't apologize for it. So where does that leave us? She asked. He looked at her across the table, that full, unhurried, complete attention that was, she had come to understand, the most private thing about him, the thing he gave almost no one, that cost him something, that was entirely real. It leaves us here, he said. Here. This table, this morning. He turned his cup. Whatever comes after. She thought about the Opus 111, about Beethoven writing his farewell to the form that had defined him, writing it deaf and certain, refusing the comfortable resolution that the sonata form traditionally demanded, instead opening the second movement into something that had no ending, only a gradually deepening light, only the ground holding beneath it all, only the thing itself in its purest and most essential form. She reached across the table and took his hand. He covered hers with his other one. They sat in the morning light, with the city moving below them, with spring coming in through the balcony door, with the music living in the walls, the way it always does in a place where it has been played enough to stay. 6 months later. The recording was finished in September. She listened to the final mix in a studio in Midtown on a Tuesday afternoon, with the producer and an engineer who had the focused, monastic quality of people who cared deeply about something technical and right. And when the last Satie piece faded into silence, she sat without speaking for a moment. "It's good," the producer said. "It's really good." She knew it was. Not with pride, which was always a slightly suspicious emotion in her experience, but with the simpler satisfaction of something accurately made, something that told the truth about where she had been and where the music had taken her. She called Marco from the studio steps, blinking in the September sun. "It's done," she said. "How's it sound?" She thought about how to answer this. "Like the last year," she said. "But the music version." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Is that good?" "Yes." She watched a cab navigate a yellow light, a child on a bike, 2 women arguing pleasantly over coffee cups, the city doing its ordinary, miraculous thing. "It is." She walked to the subway, took the train uptown, came out at Columbus Circle and walked the rest of the way, through the park where the trees were just beginning to turn,
where the fall light had that first golden quality of something ending in order to begin again. She thought about what she would cook tonight, the recipe she'd been working on, actually cooking from scratch, learning to do it properly, which she had decided sometime in the spring to treat the way she treated a new piece, with patience, with attention, with the willingness to do it wrong many times before it became something real. She thought about Thursday's performance, a smaller venue this time, 100 seats in a converted church in the village, the kind of intimate space where you could hear the audience breathe and they could hear your breath before each phrase. She was playing the Goldbergs complete for the first time, all 30 variations plus the opening and closing aria. It would take over an hour. She had been dreading it for months, and was now, a week out, something past the dread and into the quiet certainty that she had lived with those variations long enough to play them all the way through. She turned in at the building entrance, the residential side on the west. The elevator opened into the penthouse, and she was met by the smell of something cooking. Him in the kitchen, as he often was in the early evening, managing the preparation of something with the focused calm she had come to associate with this version of him, the private version, the one that belonged to this space and this life. He turned when he heard her. "How was it?" he asked. She set down her bag, crossed the kitchen to him, stood close in the warmth of the cooking, in the smell of it, and looked at his face. "Good," she said. "Really good." He looked back at her. "Then we should celebrate." "Thursday." "Tonight." She smiled, the full version, the one she'd stopped managing sometime in the winter, when managing it started requiring more effort than it was worth. "Tonight," she agreed. On the upright piano across the room, the Bach score sat open on the stand, the well-tempered clavier, the prelude in C major, the simplest and most transparent thing, 16 bars that contained everything. The city turned outside the window, the year turned, the music stayed, the way it always does, in the walls of the place that held it, in the air that had been filled with it enough to know the shape it makes when it's gone. The ground held, it always had.